What's up, heroes of fandom? Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time is one of, if not the best beat 'em up of all time. Everything about this game kicks so much ass. Music, graphics, stages, enemies, gameplay. Originally an arcade game, Turtles in Time was ported over to the Super Nintendo, was a skeleton for the Sega Genesis original The Hyperstone Heist, and was remade in 2009 in the form of Reshelled. Which one reigns supreme as the definitive way to play Turtles in Time? Does Hyperstone Heist take what made the original great and improve on it? Should you move on to modern consoles and play the bigger and updated take on a classic? Let's break it down to the nitty-gritty. Despite sharing the same name, Turtles in Time on arcade, SNES, and Reshelled each play and look very differently, and in one particular case sounds completely different. Hyperstone Heist uses the same sprites as the arcade version, and the stages are inspired by Turtles in Time and its predecessor TMNT 2, the arcade game. Stages look similar to Turtles in Time, but are different in tone. The pirate ship from Turtles in Time is just an abandoned ship in Hyperstone Heist. The prehistoric caves are just caves, but essentially they're the same thing, down to the same music, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's start off with graphics. Of all the games, the arcade version looks the absolute best. The colors are much more vibrant, there are more animations, and the sprite work is just much more detailed. On Super Nintendo, you have less animations, but still a close look. Hyperstone Heist doesn't look quite as vibrant as the Super Nintendo, but there's something about these graphics that just strike a little harder than Turtles in Time. There's a tad bit more definition to it all. But Hyperstone loses points in regards to the level introductions.
Alley Cat Blues!
Alley Cat Blues!
Boring white text over a black background? Come on. It's hard for me to choose Hyperstone Heist. Comparing the two side by side, I prefer the color of Turtles in Time over the darker colors of Hyperstone Heist. Finally, this brings us to Reshelled. Aside from a couple levels, all the levels have been toned down considerably for color. At first, back in 2009, I thought this was kind of a neat update. It gave it a more realistic look and feel. It really does feel like it's 3 AM. But the more time has passed, the more the initial novelty has worn off, and all I'm left with is thinking, why? Why would they make such a beautiful looking game look so butt ugly? What looked like a cartoon you could play now looks like ass. The look appears to reflect the 2003 TMNT cartoon, down to casting the same voice actors from that show.
My toes! My toes!
But it just does not hold up over time. Aside from Neon Knight Riders, I found it all to be considerably worse. You may have all this flash and pizzazz, but it's a dud today. Alright, let's break it down. Overall, Turtles in Time Arcade, number 1, top tier. This is followed by the Super Nintendo version, and Hyperstone Heist gets third, and in dead last is Reshelled. Why does this even exist? So we got our eyes, but what about our ears? Turtles in Time has one of the best soundtracks in video game history. Every tune is a catchy, fun composition. But ultimately, to get the best sound, it all comes down to hardware. Of course, the arcade version is going to reign supreme again. Just listen to this. It's no contest. And what does Reshelled do? Every single track has been remade. Why would you do that? Why would you take one of the most legendary soundtracks and just recreate everything? Gone are the upbeat, catchy tunes. Instead, they've been replaced with these songs that sound like they're trying to recreate, but not quite catching the same feel. You know, to be fair, I should probably take this time to note that there is another version of Turtles in Time Arcade out there. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 Mutant Nightmare on GameCube did include an unlockable version of the arcade game, which is a pretty big deal considering that before the arcade 1-up was released, this was your only way to play the arcade game outside of finding an original arcade unit. And if my reaction of coming across one of these for the first time in over 15 years is anything to go by, it wasn't that easy. This version also uses new music as well. It sucks. You can't have Turtles in Time without the complete package, and although Reshelled's music is better than Mutant Nightmare, it's still just not the same. The music isn't terrible, it's okay, but it's not Turtles in Time. So that just leaves us with Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis, a question as old as time: who has the better soundtrack? On the one hand, Super Nintendo sounds fuller and higher quality. Genesis sounds tinnier and buzzier. Like, the sound hardware isn't as great as the Super Nintendo. But taking a closer listen, there is some distinct differences. Super Nintendo's drums sound bassier. But Genesis has that bass that just slaps the living Jesus out of you. Some songs on Genesis even have more sound effects coming closer to the arcade original than the Super Nintendo does. This is where it gets kind of tricky and confusing. I'm not at all an expert on the technical specifications of each hardware. Genesis sounds worse, but it seems like they can stick more in. Super Nintendo sounds better, but it feels like it's lacking certain elements. Both feel like they have something that the other doesn't. Basically, which is better ultimately comes down to preference. I find myself listening to the Genesis soundtrack from time to time when I feel like listening to the sharper sounds of the drums and the bass slap, and then I find myself listening to the Super Nintendo for that better sound. So let's wrap it up. We got the arcade at number 1, a stalemate between the Genesis and Super Nintendo, and Reshelled in dead last again. But if we wanted to be fair, the Mutant Nightmare port is worse.
Bring that statue back, you bloated beanbag.
We have the visuals, the sound, and now the most important part of all, the game itself. It doesn't matter how good you look or how great you sound. If your gameplay is bad, the whole thing comes toppling down. How different could these 4 games possibly be? Let's start off with Turtles in Time Arcade. Back in the day, these machines were quarter munchers. They were designed to be difficult enough that you wouldn't be able to muscle through without, say, $5 worth in quarters, just to give an example. Turtles in Time displays its tougher than ideal difficulty in its barrage of enemies. Whenever you hit enemies, there's very little hit stun. Oftentimes, it feels like the enemies slip out of a combo and manage to sneak in a hit. Occasionally, you can throw the enemy at the screen or use their body on other enemies for instant kills. Sometimes you knock an enemy back and sometimes you don't. All this happens seemingly at random. To get through this game without shelling a fistful of quarters, you're going to have to be on your A game. Bosses are very similar. You'll get in a string of hits only to be knocked back. Playing the arcade 1-up version, you have unlimited continues, so this isn't much of a problem. You're basically just button mashing until all the enemies are gone. There's no real challenge here unless you're at an arcade trying to save your quarters from the inevitable. The game is designed to be unfair. The only plus I can think of for the arcade version is that it supports 4 players as opposed to the 2 players of the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. Let's move on to those. Let's talk about SNES. Gone is the cheap difficulty. Instead, what used to feel like weak slaps are now beefy smacks. Enemies are given longer hit stun when attacked, allowing for a 4-hit combo that always ends in knockback. Depending on how close you are to the enemy and what direction you're holding the pad, you can slam or throw on command. You are in complete control of your turtle, and the difficulty is a million times more fair. This extends to the Hyperstone Heist as well. Turtles in Time on Super Nintendo and Hyperstone Heist on Sega Genesis feel like video games and not just games designed to steal your money. In the arcade version, to run, you had to be holding in a direction for a short period of time to break into a stride. On Super Nintendo, you can change the settings to run on command after a double tap of the direction. Hyperstone Heist takes it a step further and adds a run button, which is ridiculous that Turtles in Time on Super Nintendo didn't have this feature given just how many buttons are on the damn thing. But that's not all. On Super Nintendo, there's a couple more adjustments. For example, Sewer Surfing in the arcade version was a, okay, you've had your fun, now it's time to pay up stage. The difficulty is ramped up tenfold, and there's a ton of cheap obstacles that are hard to avoid. On Super Nintendo, the stage is treated more like a bonus stage to net in some extra lives. This is also the case with Neon Knight Riders. The arcade version is pretty much Sewer Surfing in the future, whereas on Super Nintendo, it's another bonus stage and uses some nifty 3D effects to give a new perspective. The boss of the arcade version of Sewer Surfing is just an endurance round of pizza monsters, whereas on Super Nintendo it has an all-new boss, the Rat King. And speaking of new bosses, the arcade version of Prehistoric Turtlesaurus features Cement Man. Huh. On Super Nintendo, it's Slash, who is a million times more interesting and cool. There's also an extra level, the Technodrome, which has you face Toka and Rezar. In the arcade version, you would have fought them on the pirate ship, but on the Super Nintendo, they've been replaced by Bebop and Rocksteady, which is a nice update given how iconic these characters are. The Technodrome stage culminates with a unique boss battle that concludes with being sent through time. Makes sense. In the arcade, you go from Sewer Surfing to the past. How? Overall, the Super Nintendo may not look or sound as great as the arcade version, but it sure plays a hell of a lot better. There's just more bang for your buck. What about Hyperstone Heist? What unique elements does it bring to the table? Well, it's a shorter game, only spanning 5 stages. There are longer stages, usually consisting of different areas, and it has its own arrangement of bosses unique to this game. Tatsu from the Turtles movies and Rocksteady makes an appearance, the latter of which is based on the first Turtles arcade game. Baxter Stockman is a fly in Turtles in Time, whereas in Hyperstone Heist he is, again, based on the first arcade game. Both the Super Nintendo and Genesis end with Super Shredder as opposed to normal Shredder with lightsabers in the arcade version. Unfortunately, Hyperstone Heist has one glaring problem. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, some of the stages are based on previous Ninja Turtle video games. And although those unique stages are neat, one of those is just a stage where you have to endure all the bosses you have fought up to that point, making an already short game feel like it's lacking even more. Overall, Hyperstone Heist has a ton of cool elements and a couple quality of life improvements, but ultimately it just feels like a remix of existing ideas rather than a brand new adventure. It's a great game, but I take Turtles in Time on Super Nintendo any day over Hyperstone Heist. Which brings us to Reshelled, and the biggest, baddest, shittiest problem with this game is it's based on the arcade version, which is already a very big negative. Gone is the Technodrome, gone is the Rat King, gone is Bebop and Rocksteady, gone are the perfect controls from the Super Nintendo. Why? Why would you take something that was done so well and then rely on an outdated design for your new game? Reshelled was released in 2009. It makes sense that the home console versions were much more fair and fun than the arcade version. And that's not to say that Reshelled is as difficult as the arcade version. You don't have unlimited lives, so the game does pull its punches back a little and your health lasts much longer, but you can't throw on command, you can't land a string of 4 hits consistently. The game just doesn't play as well as it could have. And again, the soundtrack was completely scrapped. There is no reason to play this game over the other versions. Maybe, just maybe had this game replicated the Super Nintendo's controls, reinstated the new levels, and had the iconic soundtrack and used Slash, the Rat King, and Super Shredder, maybe it would have been worth playing. But as it is, man, who cares about online play? Reshelled may not be the worst game, but the fact that it's called Turtles in Time makes it terrible. When you call a game Turtles in Time, you expect a certain level of quality, you expect a certain experience, which is the most important word of this video: experience. Turtles in Time Arcade may not have aged as well as its home console counterparts, but you know why people still love it? It doesn't matter if the controls aren't as great or if it's missing content. No matter which version of Turtles in Time you play, the experience will be a good one. It doesn't matter if you have unlimited continues and no way to fail. As your eyes take in the sights and your ears take in that music, you're going to be left with a fun and memorable experience. So let's wrap it up. The Super Nintendo is the best way to play these games, in my opinion. It's got more content, better controls, and despite lacking the technical polish of its arcade counterpart, it still looks incredibly well and sounds amazing. This is followed by Hyperstone Heist. It's a game through and through, though much weaker than the Super Nintendo. They're both great games, and it's a perfect companion to Turtles in Time. Next, we have the arcade version, which is more or less a novelty in this day and age. Playing this game at home, there's really no challenge other than setting your own goals, such as seeing if you could beat this game dying as little times as possible or competing against your friends for a higher score. And at the bottom of the barrel, the crappiest of crap, the shittiest of shit, the poopiest of poopy is Reshelled. I can forgive Mutant Nightmare's port because it was a free edition. You had to buy Reshelled, and this was made in the modern era. This was made in a time when they could have made it work. If you're going to have Turtles in Time in your name, you better be ready to be judged at the same standard as this masterpiece. I'm Boyle for Heroes of Fandom. Until next time.